The mountain range stretched across the horizon like broken teeth, each peak clawing at the sky with jagged determination. Major Sarah Chen sat in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, watching the sun bleed orange across the Afghan highlands. The radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for her to hear the tension in Commander Jackson's voice. Warthog 7, this is Knife 2 actual. We need immediate air support. Enemy forces have us pinned in a valley approximately 8 clicks from your position. Sarah's fingers tightened on the flight stick. 8 kilometers wasn't far, but the terrain between her and those SEALs might as well have been another planet. The valley Commander Jackson described was notorious among pilots, a natural fortress of rock walls that rose 300 meters straight up from the valley floor. Flying into it meant navigating a corridor barely wider than her wingspan, with enemy anti-aircraft positions on both sides. Knife 2. Actual, what's your situation? Sarah kept her voice steady, professional. Years of training had taught her to stay calm when everyone else was losing their minds. We've got 15 wounded, 3 critical. Taliban forces have the valley exits blocked. We're taking heavy fire from elevated positions on both sides. We need gun runs on marked targets, but Warthog 7, I need to be straight with you. The valley is too narrow. We've had 2 Apache pilots refuse the run. They said it can't be done. Sarah pulled up the terrain map on her display. The valley appeared as a thin red line cutting through solid brown elevation markers. Her tactical computer immediately flagged it as unsuitable for fixed-wing aircraft. The recommended minimum safe altitude for the A-10 in mountainous terrain was 1,500 feet. The valley walls topped out at just over 1,000. Knife 2. I'm looking at your coordinates. Those walls are awfully close together. Copy that, Warthog 7, but we're out of options here. We've got good men bleeding out. If you can't make the run, we understand, but we need to know now so we can start planning our extraction on foot. The problem with planning an extraction on foot, Sarah knew, was that 3 critically wounded men wouldn't survive the trek. They wouldn't even survive the hour it would take to organize a ground rescue force. The SEALs had walked into an ambush, and now they were trapped like fish in a barrel. She ran the calculations in her head. The A-10 had a wingspan of 57 feet. The valley, according to her instruments, was 200 feet wide at its narrowest point. Technically possible, but that assumed perfect flying and zero turbulence with no room for error. The mountain winds in this region were unpredictable, capable of tossing aircraft around like toys. Warthog 7, we're taking casualties. Do you have eyes on our position? Sarah pushed the stick forward and began her descent. Knife 2, I'm inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Mark your position with infrared strobes and get your heads down. Warthog 7, did you copy our earlier traffic? The Apache pilots refused this run. I copied, Commander, but I'm not flying an Apache. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog, was not a graceful aircraft. It was built around a gun, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon that could spit out depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. The plane was slow, ugly, and designed to take damage. It was also the most maneuverable jet in close air support, with controls responsive enough to dance through tight spaces. Sarah had logged over 1,500 hours in the Warthog. She knew every quirk, every limitation, every unexpected capability of the aircraft. She had flown combat missions in Iraq, provided close air support in Syria, and trained in mountain warfare in Colorado. But she had never attempted anything like what she was about to do. The valley entrance appeared ahead, a dark slash in the mountainside. Sarah dropped her altitude to 500 feet, then 300, then 100. The ground rushed past beneath her in a blur of brown and gray. Her airspeed indicator showed 280 knots, faster than she wanted for this kind of flying, but she needed the speed to maintain control. Knife 2, I have visual on the valley entrance. Pop smoke on your position. Red smoke began billowing from a point halfway down the valley. Sarah could see muzzle flashes sparking from elevated positions on both valley walls. The Taliban had chosen their ambush site well. The SEALs were caught in a crossfire with no cover and no way out. She lined up her approach, aiming for the valley mouth. The rock walls seemed to leap toward her as she committed to the run. Sarah's training instructor, a gruff colonel named Morrison had once told her that the difference between a good pilot and a dead pilot was knowing when to abort. Pride kills more aviators than enemy fire, he had said. Know your limits. Sarah knew her limits. She also knew that 15 men were about to die if she turned back now. The A-10 plunged into the valley like a bullet entering a gun barrel. The world became a tunnel of rock and sky. Sarah's peripheral vision caught the blur of cliff faces racing past on both sides, so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. The turbulence hit immediately, a rolling current of air that tried to slam her into the right wall. She compensated with a sharp left adjustment, felt the aircraft respond, then had to correct back right as the wind shifted. Her altitude warning screamed. She was flying at 80 feet above the valley floor, 20 feet below the recommended minimum safe altitude. The walls rose on either side like ancient sentinels, narrowing the gap to less than 150 feet of clearance on each wingtip. Warthog 7, you are danger close to terrain. Her warning system shouted at her in a calm female voice that somehow made the situation more surreal. Sarah ignored it. Her eyes were locked on the space ahead, reading the terrain, anticipating the turns. The valley twisted left, then right, then left again. Each turn required split-second timing. Too early, and she would clip the wall. Too late, and she would not have time to correct. The red smoke appeared ahead, marking the SEAL position. Sarah could see them now. 15 figures huddled behind a rockfall, surrounded by a semicircle of Taliban fighters firing from elevated caves and outcroppings. The enemy had assumed no aircraft could reach this position. They had spread out, confident in their superiority. They had made a fatal mistake. Sarah's thumb hovered over the trigger. The targeting computer locked onto the first group of enemy fighters positioned on a ledge 40 feet above the valley floor. She squeezed the trigger and felt the Warthog shudder as the GAU-8 came to life. The sound of the gun was like tearing fabric, a deep brrrt that echoed off the valley walls and seemed to shake the mountains themselves. The depleted uranium rounds chewed through rock and flesh with equal efficiency. The ledge erupted in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah released the trigger and immediately pulled up and left, banking hard to avoid a rock outcropping. Her left wingtip passed within 10 feet of the cliff face. She could see individual stones, could make out the weathered texture of the ancient rock. Good hits, Commander Jackson's voice crackled over the radio. Enemy positions on the north wall are neutralized, but the south wall positions were still active, and Sarah was already past them, racing toward the far end of the valley. She had two choices: punch out of the valley and come back around for another run, which would take 3 minutes the SEALs didn't have, or execute a maneuver that existed only in training manuals as an example of what not to do. Sarah pulled back hard on the stick and pushed the throttles to full power. The A-10 clawed for altitude, climbing at a steep angle that pressed her back into her seat. The valley walls rose with her, maintaining their terrible proximity. At 500 feet, she leveled out briefly, then rolled inverted. The world flipped upside down. Sky became ground, ground became sky. Sarah hung in her straps, the valley floor now above her head, the open air below. She completed the roll, bringing the aircraft right side up, but now facing back the way she had come, and pushed the nose down into a steep dive back into the valley. Holy Mother of God, she heard someone whisper over the radio. Probably one of the SEALs watching from the ground. The valley walls embraced her again as she screamed back down the corridor, this time with the enemy positions on her right side. Her targeting computer acquired the southern gun emplacements. Sarah walked her fire across the cliff face, the GU-8 turning rock shelters into death traps. Spent shell casings rained from her aircraft like brass hail. The Taliban fighters never had time to react. One moment they were firing down at trapped Americans, the next they were obliterated by a machine that should never have been able to reach them. The few who survived the gun run scrambled to retreat deeper into their caves. Sarah pulled up and out of the valley, finally allowing herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking slightly on the controls, the adrenaline beginning to ebb. She had done it. She had flown a mission that 2 Apache pilots had called impossible, and she had done it in an aircraft that was never designed for that kind of precision flying. Knife 2 actual, this is Warthog 7. Enemy positions neutralized. You should have a clear path for extraction. The response took a moment. When Commander Jackson's voice came back, it was tight with emotion. Warthog 7, I don't know how you did that, but you just saved 15 lives. We are in your debt. The landing gear touched down on the runway at Bagram Airfield, just as the last light faded from the sky. Sarah taxied the A-10 toward the hardened aircraft shelter, her body finally beginning to register the toll of the mission. Her shoulders ached from the tension of holding the stick steady through those impossible turns. Her hand still trembled slightly, though whether from adrenaline or simple exhaustion she couldn't say. The ground crew was waiting as she shut down the engines. Staff Sergeant Martinez, her crew chief, stood with his arms crossed, a mixture of concern and curiosity on his weathered face. He had been maintaining A-10s for 12 years and could read the signs of hard flying the way a doctor reads symptoms. Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit dark with sweat despite the cool evening air. Martinez walked around the aircraft, his flashlight playing across the fuselage, wings, and tail section. He stopped at the left wing and let out a low whistle. Major Chen, you want to tell me how you got rock dust embedded in your wing panel? Sarah walked over to look. Sure enough, a fine gray powder was ground into the metal surface, the kind of powder that came from flying close enough to a cliff face to feel its presence. There were also several small scratches along the leading edge, marks that told the story of near misses and desperate maneuvering. Tight valley run, Sergeant? Really tight. Martinez shook his head slowly. Major, I've been working on these birds since before you pinned on your wings. I've seen combat damage from AAA fire, bird strikes, and every kind of pilot error imaginable. But I've never seen an aircraft come back with cliff dust on it. That means you were flying close enough to kiss the mountain. The mission required it. The mission required you to auger into a rock wall. Martinez's voice carried the particular tone of a senior NCO who had earned the right to question officers when their decisions bordered on suicidal. Sarah met his gaze steadily. The mission required getting ordnance on target in a valley too narrow for standard approach. 15 SEALs are alive right now because I made that run. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. Martinez studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. I imagine you would. He patted the A-10's fuselage affectionately. Lucky for all of us, she brought you home. I'll have her checked and ready for the next sortie, but Major, next time you decide to thread a needle with a $30 million aircraft, maybe give me a heads up first so I can have the prayer beads ready. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Noted, Sergeant. The walk to the operations building felt longer than usual. Word had already spread through the base about the valley run. Pilots and ground crew stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. Some nodded with respect. Others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. In the close-knit world of military aviation, news traveled at the speed of radio waves. Captain Brad Stevens, one of the Apache pilots who had refused the mission, stood near the operations entrance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of squared-jaw confidence that came from years of flying attack helicopters. He stepped into Sarah's path as she approached. Heard you made the run into Dragon Valley. Sarah had not known the valley had a name, but Dragon Valley seemed appropriate. The SEALs needed support. The SEALs needed a lot of things. A suicide run wasn't one of them. Stevens crossed his arms. You know why I turned down that mission, Chen? Because I've been flying combat operations for 9 years. I know the difference between brave and stupid. What you did today was stupid. Other pilots had gathered now, drawn by the confrontation. Sarah was aware of their presence but kept her focus on Stevens. This was not the first time she had faced this kind of challenge, and it would not be the last. Being a female pilot in a male-dominated field meant constantly proving herself, constantly defending decisions that would never be questioned if she were a man. The mission parameters were clear, Sarah said quietly. 15 men were under fire with no extraction options. The valley run was dangerous but feasible. Feasible? Stevens laughed, but there was no humor in it. Major, that valley is barely wider than your wingspan. The turbulence alone should have knocked you into the wall. You got lucky, pure and simple. And now every hotshot pilot on this base is going to think they can pull the same stunt. I didn't get lucky, Captain. I flew my aircraft within its operational envelope and delivered ordnance on target. The A-10 is more maneuverable than your Apache, and I have 1,500 hours learning exactly what it can do. The Apache pilots who scouted that valley have a combined 20 years of experience. They both said it was impossible. Sarah felt her temper beginning to rise but kept her voice level. Then I suppose I proved them wrong. The door to the operations building opened and Colonel Mitchell stepped out. He was a lean man in his mid-50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had flown F-16s during Desert Storm and A-10s during the initial invasion of Afghanistan. Every pilot on the base respected him, and most were terrified of disappointing him. Captain Stevens, I believe you have a mission brief to prepare for tomorrow's sortie. It was not a suggestion. Stevens snapped to attention. Yes, sir. He gave Sarah one last look, then walked away. The gathered pilots dispersed quickly, sensing that the show was over. Colonel Mitchell gestured for Sarah to follow him inside. They walked in silence through the corridors until they reached his office. He closed the door and pointed to a chair. Sarah sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. I've reviewed the combat footage from your aircraft, Mitchell began, settling into his own chair behind a desk covered with mission reports and intelligence briefings. I've also listened to the radio traffic and spoken with Commander Jackson. He was very complimentary about your flying. Thank you, sir. He also said you're either the bravest pilot he's ever seen or the craziest. He wasn't sure which. Sarah waited. She had learned early in her career that sometimes the best response was silence. Mitchell pulled up a video on his computer and turned the monitor so Sarah could see. It showed the helmet camera footage from her cockpit, the valley walls rushing past in a blur of rock and shadow. Even watching it after the fact, knowing she had survived, the footage was terrifying. The margins for error were measured in feet, sometimes in inches. I'm going to ask you a question, Major, and I want an honest answer. When you committed to that valley run, did you believe you could make it? Or did you decide it was worth dying to try? Sarah considered the question carefully. Sir, I believed I could make it. The aircraft was within operational limits, the conditions were manageable. The risk was high but calculated. And if you had clipped a wing, if the turbulence had been worse, if you had misjudged a turn by even a few degrees, then I would have died, sir. But the alternative was letting 15 men die for certain. When I weigh those options, the choice seems clear. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating eyes. Captain Stevens thinks you're reckless. He's telling everyone who will listen that you took an unnecessary risk to prove a point. What point would that be, sir? That a woman can fly combat missions as well as any man. That you're not afraid to take risks that male pilots avoid. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but kept it from reaching her face. Sir, I took that mission because men were dying and I had the capability to help them. My gender had nothing to do with it. I believe you, Major. But perception matters in this business. Fair or not, you're going to be judged differently because you're a woman. Every decision you make will be scrutinized. Every risk you take will be questioned. That's the reality you're facing. So what are you saying, sir? That I should have let those SEALs die to avoid giving people something to talk about? Mitchell shook his head. No. I'm saying you need to be aware of the politics. What you did today will make some people respect you and others resent you. The SEALs will tell everyone you're a hero. The Apache pilots will say you're a showboat who got lucky. Your fellow A-10 drivers will be divided. Some will admire your skill, others will worry you're setting a dangerous precedent. What do you think, sir? The colonel was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. I think you flew one hell of a mission. I also think you scared me half to death watching that footage. But most importantly, I think you brought 15 men home alive, and that's what matters in this business. Relief washed through Sarah, though she was careful not to let it show. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. I'm recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross, which means your mission is going to get a lot of attention. Pentagon brass, media, the works. Are you prepared for that? Sarah had not considered this aspect. She had been focused on the mission, on the immediate problem of keeping men alive. The idea of medals and attention felt strange, almost inappropriate. "I just did my job, sir." "You did your job exceptionally well. But that means people are going to want to talk about it. You'll be held up as an example for better or worse. Female pilots breaking barriers, women in combat, all of that. Can you handle it?" "I'll handle whatever comes, sir." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I believe you will." "Dismissed, Major. Get some rest. You've earned it." Sarah stood and saluted. As she turned to leave, Mitchell spoke again. "Chen, one more thing. What you did today was incredible flying." 3 days after the Dragon Valley mission, Sarah found herself sitting in a briefing room with 12 other pilots, watching Colonel Mitchell point to a map of the Nuristan province. The area was marked with red circles indicating known Taliban strongholds and yellow triangles, showing friendly forward operating bases. Between them lay hundreds of square miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Intelligence reports suggest the Taliban are moving significant weapons shipments through this mountain corridor, Mitchell explained, tapping a narrow pass that wound between 2 peaks. "We've got eyes on the ground confirming multiple supply convoys. They're using the terrain to avoid our surveillance assets, moving at night through valleys too tight for our standard patrol routes." Captain Jenkins, an experienced A-10 pilot with 3 combat deployments, raised his hand. "Sir, if those valleys are too tight for surveillance, they're going to be too tight for effective airstrikes. We'd be looking at the same situation as Dragon Valley." Mitchell nodded. "Exactly. Which is why Major Chen will be taking lead on developing new tactical approaches for operations in extreme terrain. She'll be working with intelligence to identify targets that require precision flying in confined spaces." Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Some of the looks were curious, others skeptical. A few pilots, including Stevens, wore expressions that bordered on hostile. She kept her face neutral, waiting for the colonel to continue. "I know some of you have concerns about the Dragon Valley mission. You think it was too risky, too dangerous, that we got lucky more than anything else. Let me be clear about something. Luck had nothing to do with it. Major Chen executed a precision strike in conditions that would have destroyed a lesser pilot. She proved that the A-10 in the right hands can operate in environments we previously considered impossible. That gives us a tactical advantage the enemy doesn't expect." Stevens spoke up. "Sir, with respect, turning one successful mission into standard operating procedure seems premature. We don't know if Major Chen can repeat that performance. For all we know, she used up a lifetime's worth of luck in that valley." "Then I guess we'll find out," Mitchell said calmly, "because Major Chen will be leading training exercises starting tomorrow. Any pilot who wants to learn extreme terrain flying will report to the mountain range east of Kabul at 0600. Participation is voluntary, but I strongly encourage everyone to attend. The enemy is adapting to our tactics. We need to adapt faster." The briefing continued with discussions of other operational matters, but Sarah barely heard them. Her mind was already working through the challenges ahead. Training pilots to fly in confined spaces was dangerous under the best circumstances. Some of them would resist her instruction, either because they thought she was reckless or because they resented taking orders from a woman. Others might push themselves too hard trying to match what she had done, and that could get someone killed. After the briefing ended, Sarah gathered her materials and headed for the door. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, one of the few other female pilots on the base, caught up with her in the hallway. "That was quite an announcement," Rodriguez said. She was small, barely meeting the height requirements for pilot training, with dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence. "How do you feel about becoming the base's resident expert on suicidal flying techniques?" Sarah smiled despite herself. Rodriguez had a way of cutting through tension with humor. "I'm less worried about the suicidal part and more worried about the teaching part. Some of those pilots are going to resent every minute of training. Let them resent it. You saved 15 lives. You proved something important. Now you get to share that knowledge with people who need it, whether they want to admit it or not." They walked together toward the flight line, where maintenance crews were preparing aircraft for the next day's operations. The sun was setting, painting the surrounding mountains in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful and terrible, a landscape that had defeated armies for thousands of years. "Can I ask you something?" Rodriguez said, her tone more serious now. "When you went into that valley, were you scared?" Sarah considered lying, then decided Rodriguez deserved honesty. "Terrified. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back. But I kept thinking about those SEALs, about their families, about what it would mean if I didn't try. The fear didn't go away, but it became less important than the mission. That's what makes you different from people like Stevens. He thinks courage means not being afraid. You understand that courage means being afraid and doing it anyway. Before Sarah could respond, a voice called out from behind them.
Major Chen!
They turned to see Commander Jackson approaching, flanked by 2 other SEALs. Jackson was a mountain of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and scar tissue, with a beard that would have violated regulations for anyone else. The other 2 SEALs were equally imposing, carrying themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had faced death and come through intact. Commander Jackson, Sarah said, surprised. I heard you and your team made it back safely. We did, thanks to you. Jackson extended his hand and Sarah shook it, feeling the strength in his grip. I wanted to come by and thank you properly. This is Lieutenant Morrison and Chief Petty Officer Davis. They were with me in that valley. Morrison was younger, probably late 20s, with bright blue eyes and a ready smile. Major, I've been in some tight spots over the years, but I've never seen flying like what you did. When you came screaming down that valley the second time upside down, I thought I was hallucinating from blood loss. Davis, older and more weathered, nodded agreement. Ma'am, I've worked with every branch of military aviation. Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army. I've seen good pilots and bad pilots and everything in between. What you did was something else entirely. You flew like the mountain was part of you, like you knew exactly where every rock and gust of wind was going to be before it happened. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Praise from fellow pilots was one thing, but hearing it from the men she had saved carried a different weight. I appreciate that, Chief, but I was just doing my job. No, ma'am, you weren't, Jackson said firmly. Your job was to provide air support within safe operational parameters. What you did was risk your life to save ours. That goes beyond duty. That's brotherhood, or in this case, sisterhood. In the SEAL teams, we have a saying, nobody fights alone. You proved that applies to everyone wearing the uniform, regardless of which service or which aircraft. Rodriguez had quietly stepped back, giving them space for the conversation. Sarah was grateful for her tact. This moment felt important, sacred even, though she could not quite articulate why. Commander, how are your wounded? Sarah asked. Jackson's expression darkened slightly. 3 required immediate surgery, but they're stable now. They'll all make it home. Without your support, at least half our team would have died in that valley. We were running out of ammunition, running out of options. You gave us a chance. I'm glad I could help. Major, we're having a small gathering tonight at the SEAL compound. Just the team and a few close friends. We'd be honored if you would join us. We want to properly thank the pilot who saved our lives. Sarah hesitated. Socializing with special operations personnel was unusual, and she did not want to presume on their hospitality. But she also recognized that refusing would be an insult. These men were offering her something rare and valuable, acceptance into their community. I'd be honored, Commander. Jackson smiled, transforming his scarred face into something almost gentle. Outstanding. 2,000 hours. Ask any MP where the SEAL compound is, they'll point you in the right direction. Fair warning though, once we start telling stories, it's hard to get us to shut up. After the SEALs left, Rodriguez reappeared at Sarah's side. You know you've officially made it, right? The teams don't invite just anyone to their gatherings. They must really respect what you did, or they feel obligated. Trust me, SEALs don't do anything out of obligation. If they didn't want you there, they wouldn't have asked. This is genuine. Sarah spent the afternoon reviewing flight plans and maintenance reports, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She had interacted with special operations forces before, but always in a professional capacity, always maintaining the formal distance between different military specialties. This would be different. This would be personal. At 2,000 hours exactly, Sarah arrived at the SEAL compound. It was separated from the main base by concrete walls and armed guards, a secure area where the teams could operate with privacy. The guard at the gate checked her ID and waved her through with a knowing smile. Inside, the compound was surprisingly comfortable. The buildings were simple but well maintained, with personal touches that spoke of men trying to create a home away from home. Music played from somewhere, classic rock mixed with country. The smell of grilling meat filled the air. Jackson met her at the door of the main building. He had changed out of his combat uniform into casual clothes, though he still carried himself with military bearing. Major Chen, welcome. Come on in, meet the team. The room inside was filled with SEALs in various states of relaxation. Some were playing cards. Others were watching a movie on a large television. 2 weeks after establishing the Extreme Terrain Training Program, Sarah received orders that would test everything she had learned and taught. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in the Panjshir Valley, a legendary gorge that had resisted conquest by everyone from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union. The target was a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces, and he would be vulnerable for exactly 48 hours while moving between safe houses. The briefing room was crowded with personnel from multiple units: Army Rangers, Delta Force operators, Air Force intelligence analysts, and a contingent of SEALs led by Commander Jackson. Colonel Mitchell stood at the front, his expression grave as he outlined the mission parameters. "The target will be moving through this section of the Panjshir Valley," Mitchell said, highlighting a narrow gorge on the digital map. The valley floor is barely 100 feet wide in places, with walls rising over 2,000 feet. It's a natural fortress, which is why the Taliban feels safe using it as a transit route. Captain Willis, a Ranger Company commander, leaned forward to study the map more closely. "Sir, how do we insert ground forces into that terrain? There's no landing zone, no approach route that wouldn't be observed from miles away." "We don't insert ground forces," Mitchell replied. "This will be a pure airstrike. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, maximum precision. The margin for error is 0. If we miss this window, the target disappears for months, maybe permanently." Sarah felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders before Mitchell even turned to look at her. She had known this was coming the moment she saw the mission profile. "Major Chen, you'll be flying lead on this operation. Based on your Dragon Valley performance and the training you've conducted, you're the only pilot we have with the demonstrated capability to execute this mission." Around the room, reactions were mixed. Some officers nodded approval. Others looked concerned. Jackson caught Sarah's eye and gave a slight nod of confidence. "Sir, what's the timeline?" Sarah asked. "The target enters the valley at 0400 tomorrow. You'll have a 20-minute window while he's traveling through the narrowest section. Weather forecast shows clear skies but high winds. Terrain turbulence will be significant." Sarah moved to the map and studied the valley profile. It was worse than Dragon Valley in almost every respect: narrower, deeper, with more severe turns and elevation changes. The target's convoy would be moving, which meant she would need to track and engage mobile vehicles in extremely confined space, while dealing with potential anti-aircraft fire. "What about enemy air defenses?" she asked. An intelligence analyst, a young lieutenant named Parker, pulled up threat assessments on the screen. "We've identified at least 3 mobile anti-aircraft positions in the valley, possibly more. Russian-made Zu-23 autocannons, effective range about 8,000 feet. They'll have overlapping fields of fire covering most of the valley. So I'll be flying into a shooting gallery with no room to maneuver." "That's an accurate assessment, Major," Mitchell said quietly. Sarah studied the map for another long moment, running calculations in her head. Approach speed, angle of attack, weapons delivery parameters, escape routes. Every variable had to be perfect because there was no margin for error. One mistake and she would either fail the mission or become another name on the memorial wall. "I'll need detailed reconnaissance footage of the valley," Sarah said finally. "Every turn, every rock formation, wind patterns at different times of day. I want to know that valley better than the Taliban do." "We've got drone footage from the past 6 months, Parker said. "I'll have it compiled and ready for review within 2 hours. I'll also need weather updates every 3 hours until mission launch. Wind conditions in that valley could change rapidly." Mitchell nodded. "Anything else?" Sarah turned to face the room, making eye contact with the assembled officers. "I need everyone to understand something. This mission pushes the A-10 beyond what it was designed to do. If conditions are worse than expected, if the wind is too strong or the visibility too poor, I will abort. No target is worth throwing away an aircraft and a pilot on a suicide run." "Agreed," Mitchell said immediately. "You'll have full authority to abort if conditions are unsafe. But Major, if you believe the mission is feasible, we need you to take that shot. This target is responsible for the deaths of dozens of coalition personnel. Taking him off the board will save lives." The meeting continued with detailed planning for support elements, search and rescue assets, and communication protocols. But Sarah's mind was already in that valley. visualizing the flight path, anticipating the challenges she would face. After the briefing, Jackson approached her in the hallway. "Major, my team is assigned to Quick Reaction Force for this mission. If something goes wrong, we'll be ready to go in and get you." "Commander, if something goes wrong in that valley, there won't be much you can do. I'll either make it out or I won't. There's no middle ground at that altitude." Jackson's expression was serious. "Then I guess you'd better make it out. My team still owes you that drink, and SEALs always pay their debts." Sarah spent the next 18 hours preparing. She reviewed every second of drone footage, memorizing the valley's features until she could navigate it in her sleep. She studied wind patterns, identified the most dangerous sections, and planned 3 different approach vectors depending on conditions at launch time. The maintenance crews went over her A-10 with microscopic attention to detail. Staff Sergeant Martinez personally inspected every system, every connection, every component. "Major, this bird is as ready as she'll ever be," he said as the final checks were completed. "She'll get you there and back, I guarantee it." At 0200, Sarah suited up in her flight gear. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute, broken only by the lights of the airfield and the glow of her aircraft's instruments. The flight line was quiet, most of the base still sleeping, unaware of the mission about to launch. Colonel Mitchell was waiting at her aircraft. "Major Chen, I won't insult you with empty platitudes about being careful. You know the risks better than anyone. But I will say this. What you're about to attempt is the most difficult close air support mission in modern military history. Success or failure, you've already proven yourself as one of the finest combat pilots I've ever served with." "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best to make it a success." Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began her startup procedures. The familiar routine was comforting, a ritual that centered her mind and prepared her for what lay ahead. Engines spooled up with their distinctive whine. Systems came online one by one, green lights confirming readiness across the board. Bagram Tower, Warthog 7 requesting clearance for departure. "Warthog 7, you are cleared for departure. Godspeed, Major." The A-10 rolled down the runway and lifted into the darkness. Sarah climbed to cruising altitude and set course for the Panjshir Valley. 40 minutes away, the stars above were brilliant, untouched by the violence and politics of the world below. Up here, surrounded by sky and silence, Sarah felt a clarity of purpose that was impossible to find on the ground. The radio crackled with an update from intelligence. "Warthog 7, target convoy has entered the valley on schedule. 3 vehicles, estimated speed 20 kilometers per hour. You are cleared hot on all vehicles." "Copy that." Beginning approach. The mountains appeared as dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. Sarah descended toward the valley entrance, dropping to 500 feet, then 300, then 100. The world compressed into a tunnel of rock and shadow. Her night vision systems painted the terrain in shades of green, revealing details invisible to the naked eye. The valley walls rose on either side like the walls of a tomb. Sarah felt the turbulence immediately, powerful gusts of wind that tried to slam her aircraft into the rocks. She compensated with smooth, practiced movements, never fighting the aircraft but guiding it through the chaos. Her targeting system acquired the convoy ahead, 3 vehicles moving slowly through the narrow passage. They were confident, secure in the belief that no aircraft could reach them in this natural fortress. They were wrong. The first anti-aircraft position opened fire, tracers arcing up from a ledge on the left wall. Sarah saw them coming, anticipated the firing pattern, and adjusted her flight path. The rounds passed harmlessly behind her tail section. The gunners had not expected an aircraft moving this low, this fast, through terrain they considered impassable. Sarah lined up on the lead vehicle and squeezed the trigger. The Gao-8 roared to life, its distinctive brrr-t echoing off the valley walls. The depleted uranium rounds tore through the vehicle's armor like paper, turning it into a burning wreck in seconds. The convoy scattered, the remaining vehicles accelerating in an attempt to escape. But there was nowhere to go in the narrow valley. Sarah banked hard left, pulling G-forces that pressed her into her seat, and came around for another pass. The second anti-aircraft position had found her range. Tracers filled the air ahead, a curtain of fire she would have to fly through. Sarah jinked right, then left, then dove even lower, dropping to 50 feet above the valley floor. The tracers passed overhead, the gunners unable to adjust fast enough. She acquired the second vehicle and fired again. Another hit, another kill. The Pentagon was nothing like Sarah had imagined. She had expected marble halls and stern portraits of generals, which it had, But she had not expected the warmth of the morning sun through tall windows or the surprisingly normal coffee shop where officers lined up just like any other workplace. She stood in the corridor outside a briefing room, wearing her dress blues with the newly awarded Distinguished Flying Cross pinned above her other ribbons, feeling distinctly uncomfortable. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Martinez said with a slight smile. Martinez was a career officer from the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Division, assigned to escort Sarah through the day's schedule. "Relax, Major, they're going to love you in there. I'm a pilot, ma'am, not a public speaker. I fly planes. I shoot bad guys. I don't do presentations for generals and politicians. Today you do. The Panjshir Valley mission is being held up as a textbook example of precision air power. The Joint Chiefs want to understand the tactical innovations you've developed. Congress wants to hear about women in combat roles. The media wants a hero story. You're going to give all of them what they need." Sarah wanted to argue but knew it would be pointless. This was part of the job now, whether she liked it or not. The Dragon Valley mission had made her famous within military circles. The Panjshir Valley mission had made her famous everywhere else. Newspapers had run stories about the female pilot who flew through mountains. Television news had done segments on revolutionary close air support tactics. She had even been mentioned by the president during a press conference about progress in Afghanistan. The briefing room doors opened and Martinez gestured for Sarah to enter. Inside, a dozen senior officers sat around a large conference table. Sarah recognized several of them from their photographs: General Hammond, the Air Force Chief of Staff, Admiral Prescott, who oversaw Joint Special Operations, and General Chen, no relation, who commanded all air operations in Afghanistan. Others wore uniforms from allied nations, including a British Air Marshal and a Canadian Brigadier General. "Major Chen, welcome," General Hammond said, standing to shake her hand. He was a tall man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in cockpits before transitioning to command positions. "We've been looking forward to hearing about your operations firsthand. Please have a seat." Sarah sat at the head of the table, acutely aware of all the stars and eagles in the room. A technician helped her set up her presentation, connecting her laptop to the room's display system. She had spent 3 days preparing the briefing, distilling months of experience into a format that would be useful to senior leadership. "Good morning, sirs and ma'ams," Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been asked to brief you on extreme terrain close air support tactics as developed and tested in Afghanistan. What I'll show you today represents a fundamental shift in how we approach confined space operations." She clicked through to the first slide, showing a 3-dimensional terrain map of Dragon Valley. Traditional doctrine states that fixed-wing aircraft should maintain minimum safe altitudes based on terrain and operational requirements. In mountainous regions, this typically means flying at least 1,500 feet above ground level. However, this doctrine was developed for conventional combat scenarios and doesn't account for the terrain-shielded positions that insurgent forces increasingly use. Sarah walked through the Dragon Valley mission in detail, explaining her decision-making process, the calculated risks she had taken, and the techniques she had used to maintain control in extreme conditions. The generals listened intently, occasionally asking technical questions that she answered with precision. "The key insight," Sarah explained, "is that the A-10's design characteristics make it uniquely suited for this kind of flying. The straight wings provide excellent low-speed maneuverability. The engines mounted high on the fuselage reduce debris ingestion risk. The redundant control systems mean that even with significant battle damage, the aircraft remains controllable. We've been underutilizing these capabilities because we were bound by doctrine designed for different aircraft and different missions." General Hammond leaned forward. "Major, you make it sound almost routine. But the fact remains that you've attempted maneuvers that other pilots, including experienced Apache drivers, refuse to try. What makes you confident that this can be taught and replicated rather than being a unique skill set?" It was a fair question, and Sarah had expected it. "Sir, I've now trained 43 pilots in extreme terrain operations. Of those, 38 have successfully completed qualification in valleys with similar characteristics to Dragon Valley. The key is progressive training, starting with relatively easy scenarios and building up to more challenging ones. It's not about individual talent. It's about developing skills through structured practice." "And the 5 who didn't complete qualification?" Admiral Prescott asked. 2 washed out due to air sickness in the confined spaces. One had insufficient experience in type, though he's expected to qualify after logging more A-10 hours. Two recognized that they didn't have the temperament for this kind of flying and voluntarily withdrew. I consider their self-awareness a positive outcome. The last thing we need is pilots attempting these missions before they're ready. The briefing continued for another hour, covering the Panjshir Valley mission, lessons learned, recommendations for doctrine updates, and proposals for expanding the training program. Sarah showed gun camera footage, terrain analysis, and statistical data on mission success rates. She was thorough, professional, and increasingly comfortable as she focused on the technical aspects rather than the politics. When she finished, General Hammond stood and extended his hand. Major Chen, that was one of the most impressive operational briefings I've heard in my 30 years of service. You've not only developed innovative tactics but also demonstrated the ability to teach them to others. That's the difference between a good pilot and someone who changes how we fight wars. After the generals filed out, Martinez approached with a sympathetic expression. You survived the Joint Chiefs. Now comes the hard part. Congress wants to see you this afternoon. The congressional hearing was held in a wood-paneled room that smelled of old leather and political ambition. Cameras lined the back wall, recording everything for the public record. Sarah sat at a witness table facing a semicircle of senators and representatives, many of whom looked at her with expressions ranging from genuine interest to transparent calculation about how her testimony could be used for their agendas. Senator Walsh, the committee chairman, opened the hearing with remarks about American innovation and the changing face of modern warfare. Then he turned his attention to Sarah. Major Chen, your missions in Afghanistan have captured the public imagination. Can you tell us in your own words what motivated you to attempt flights that other pilots considered impossible? Sarah had been coached on how to answer questions like this, but she decided to ignore the careful political language and speak honestly. Senator, I was motivated by the same thing that motivates every service member. Men were dying and I had the capability to help them. When I looked at Dragon Valley, I didn't see an impossible mission. I saw a difficult mission with acceptable risk if executed properly. The choice between attempting a difficult rescue and watching men die was not really a choice at all. Representative Carlson, a former Army officer, nodded approvingly. Major, there's been considerable debate in this body about women in combat roles. Some argue that women lack the physical strength or mental toughness for frontline service. Your mission seemed to directly contradict that argument. What's your perspective? This was dangerous territory and Sarah knew it. Anything she said could be twisted for political purposes. But she also knew that silence would be seen as weakness. Representative, I can't speak for all women any more than one male pilot can speak for all men. What I can say is that flying a combat aircraft is primarily about skill, judgment, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. Physical strength matters less in a cockpit than it does in infantry combat. Mental toughness is universal, not gender-specific. I've seen male pilots panic and female pilots stay cool under fire. I've also seen the reverse. The question shouldn't be about gender. It should be about capability. Senator Morrison, known for conservative views on military issues, spoke next. Major Chen, I respect your service and your bravery, but I'm concerned about the message we're sending. You took extraordinary risks that resulted in significant damage to your aircraft. Should we really be encouraging pilots to push boundaries this way? What happens when someone tries to replicate your missions and fails? Senator, every combat mission involves calculated risk. We train pilots to assess situations and make decisions based on their capabilities and the tactical requirements. The extreme terrain training program includes extensive instruction on when to abort missions, when conditions exceed safe parameters, and how to recognize personal limitations. We're not encouraging recklessness. We're expanding the envelope of what's possible so that when commanders need these capabilities, they're available. The hearing continued for 2 more hours.